Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're diving into a heart-stopping moment. A terrified witness arrives at Tu Tieu's tea house with evidence about the missing documents. But the moment he sees Mr. Tuan's photo, he flees in panic. What is Mr. Tuan hiding that scares people into silence? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. The morning started the way Tu Tieu loved most: quiet, misty, and full of small rituals that made the world feel manageable. She wiped down the wooden tables with a damp cloth, moving in slow circles, letting the rhythm calm her mind. The kettle hummed on the stove, sending soft trails of steam toward the ceiling. Outside, the mountains were barely visible through the fog, like giants sleeping under blankets. A message from Yuri, sent just before sunrise. Good morning. Did you sleep? Don't skip breakfast. I'll call you after the site meeting. She smiled softly, her thumb hovering over the screen. Yuri never wrote long messages, but every word felt like a hand on her shoulder. She typed back, I slept. Did you? Remember to breathe today. His reply came quickly. I will. You too. Tu Tieu set the phone down and poured herself a small cup of tea, wrapping her fingers around the warmth. The tea house was hers, a simple place with wooden chairs, hand-painted signs, and shelves lined with jars of dried herbs. And lately, safety felt like the most precious thing she owned. She was just about to open the shutters wider when she heard the low rumble of a motorbike slowing down outside. Tu Tieu paused, listening. The engine cut off. Footsteps approached, hesitant, like someone who wasn't sure they should be there. A man stood in the doorway, older, maybe in his mid-50s, wearing a faded work jacket and mud-stained boots. His face was lined with exhaustion, and his eyes darted around the room as if checking for exits. Tu Tieu set down her cup and stepped forward gently. Good morning, she said, her voice warm but careful. Please, come in. You're welcome here. He studied her face, then glanced over his shoulder at the empty road. Finally, he stepped inside and let the door close softly behind him. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice rough like he hadn't used it much lately. Tu Tieu gestured to a table near the window. Sit wherever you're comfortable. I'll bring tea. He sat slowly, placing his hands flat on the table like he was steadying himself. Tu Tieu moved to the counter, selecting a simple ceramic pot and pouring fresh tea with care. When she brought it to him, she noticed his hands. They were shaking slightly. You look like someone carrying a heavy load, Tu Tieu said gently, setting the cup in front of him. The man's eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment, something cracked in his expression. Tu Tieu sat across from him, leaving space between them so he wouldn't feel crowded. She said, Just take your time. The man wrapped his hands around the cup, absorbing the warmth. He took a sip, and his shoulders dropped slightly, like the tea was permission to relax. I used to drive, he said finally. Deliveries, documents, packages, things people needed moved quietly. Tu Tieu listened without interrupting, her face open and calm. I worked for a few different companies, the man continued, his voice gaining a little strength. Small jobs mostly. But a few months ago, I did some work for a construction company. He paused, watching her reaction. Tu Tieu's heart beat a little faster, but she kept her expression gentle. That must have been hard work, she said carefully. The man nodded. It was, but it wasn't the work that bothered me. He looked down at his tea, his jaw tightening. It was what I saw. Tu Tieu leaned in slightly, her voice soft. You can speak slowly, she said. I'm listening. The man exhaled shakily. I delivered papers. Important ones. Board authorizations. Contract addendums. Things with official seals. I wasn't supposed to read them, and I didn't. but I saw who I gave them to. And I saw things that didn't sit right. Tu Tieu's mind raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Do you remember when this was?" she asked gently. The man's eyes clouded with memory. "It was around the time that woman, Mrs. Nagia, was sick. Or people said she was sick. I remember because the company was quieter than usual, fewer people in the office. And the papers you delivered. Who received them?" The man hesitated, his fingers tightening around the cup. There was a young woman, polished, always dressed like she was going to a meeting, even when no one else was around. She had an assistant with her sometimes. They were the ones who took the envelope from me. "Lynn," Tu Tieu whispered, more to herself than to him. The man's eyes widened. "You know her?" Tu Tieu nodded slowly. "I know of her." The man's face darkened. She excused herself gently, rising from the table. "I need to make a quick call," she said softly. "Please, stay. You're safe here." She stepped into the small back room, her hands trembling as she pulled out her phone and dialed Yuri. He answered on the second ring. "Tu Tieu?" His voice was calm but alert. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay," she whispered. "But Yuri, there's someone here. A man." Tu Tieu could almost hear Yuri thinking, processing, staying steady. Yuri asked quietly. "Yes, he's scared, but he's talking." "Good," Yuri said gently. "Don't push him too fast. Just listen. Ask simple questions, dates, locations, what he carried, who he saw. Nothing that makes him feel interrogated." Tu Tieu nodded even though he couldn't see her. "Okay. And Tu Tieu?" Yuri's voice softened. "You're doing the right thing. Slow and safe. I'm here if you need me." She closed her eyes briefly, letting his voice steady her. "Thank you." When she returned to the table, the man was staring out the window, his expression distant. Tu Tieu sat down again, this time with a small notebook, though she held it loosely, not like evidence, just like a way to remember. "Can you tell me more about that day?" she asked gently. "Whatever you remember, even small details." The man turned back to her, searching her face for judgment. Finding none, he exhaled slowly. It was late afternoon. The light was orange, the kind that makes everything look like it's ending. I pulled up to the office building. There was a black car parked near the side entrance, expensive, tinted windows. I remember thinking it didn't match the rest of the lot. Tu Tieu nodded, encouraging him. I brought the envelope inside. It was sealed, stamped with the company logo. But when I handed it to the assistant, she opened it right there in front of me, like she was checking something. I wasn't supposed to see, but I did. "What did you see?" Tu Tieu asked softly. The man's voice dropped. There was a page missing. The envelope had been opened before I could tell by the way the seal was broken, and there was a second folder tucked inside the assistant's bag. "Did you see what was on the papers?" "No, but I remember the smell, fresh ink. Like something had just been printed. And there was a distinctive clip on the second folder, silver with a small engraving. I noticed because my daughter used to collect things like that." Tu Tieu wrote carefully, her hand steady even though her heart was racing. "And Lynn? Was she there?" The man nodded. "She came out of the office just as I was leaving. She didn't look at me, people like her don't see drivers. But she was on the phone, and I heard her say something about timeline and authorization. She sounded pleased." Tu Tieu set down her pen and looked at him with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "I know this isn't easy." The man's eyes glistened. "I don't know your battles," he said. "I only know what my eyes saw, and I can't sleep anymore, knowing I didn't say anything." "Truth doesn't need shouting," she said gently. "It only needs a safe place to land." The man's shoulders shook slightly, and he nodded. I don't want to go to the police. I have a family. If Lin finds out, you don't have to, Tu Tieu interrupted softly. You can leave an anonymous note, or just a first name, or nothing at all. You've already done something brave just by coming here. Tu Tieu stood and brought him a small plate of rice cakes, setting it down gently. Eat, she said. You've carried this long enough. Let it rest for a moment. He took a small bite, and for the first time since he arrived, his face softened. They sat in comfortable silence, the sound of the kettle humming in the background. Then Tu Tieu remembered something. She pulled out her phone, scrolling carefully until she found a photo Yuri had sent her weeks ago, a company document with a picture of Mr. Tuan at a board meeting. She hesitated, not wanting to push, but knowing it mattered. Can I show you something? She asked gently. The man looked up, wary but willing. Tu Tieu turned the phone toward him. Have you seen this man before? The moment the man's eyes landed on the photo, everything changed. His face drained of color. His hands, which had been steady on the table, began to tremble again. The rice cake slipped from his fingers. Where did you get that? He whispered, his voice tight with fear. Tu Tieu kept her tone calm. He's connected to the company. Do you recognize him? The man pushed back from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I shouldn't have come here, he muttered, standing abruptly. I can't be involved in this. Please, Tu Tieu said gently, rising with him but not blocking his path. You're safe here. No one knows you came. But the man was already moving toward the door, his breath coming fast. His car, he said, almost to himself. His car was there that day, parked next to the black one. I didn't think anything of it then. But now, he stopped, his hand on the door handle, and turned back to her with haunted eyes. He was there. He knew. Who is he? Tu Tieu asked softly, though she already suspected. The man whispered, He's the one who scares people into silence. And then, before Tu Tieu could say another word, the man pulled the door open and stepped outside. The mist swallowed him almost immediately. Tu Tieu heard the motorbike start, the engine roaring too loud in the quiet morning, and then fading as he disappeared down the road. Tu Tieu stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. She looked both ways, scanning for any vehicles that might have been watching, but saw nothing. She stepped back inside, locked the door carefully, and leaned against it, her mind racing. She picked up her phone with shaking hands and called Yuri. He answered immediately. Tu Tieu, what happened? She took a breath, steadying herself. He was here, the witness. He told me everything about the delivery, about Lin, about the missing page. Yuri, it's exactly what we suspected. That's good, Yuri said gently. That's evidence. But Yuri, Tu Tieu's voice cracked slightly. I showed him a photo of Mr. Tuan. There was a pause. And? He ran, Tu Tieu whispered. He recognized him. He said Mr. Tuan was there that day, and then he left. He was terrified. He said Mr. Tuan scares people into silence. Yuri was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was calm but serious. Then Mr. Tuan is deeper in this than we thought. Tu Tieu pressed her hand to her forehead, trying to think clearly. Yuri, what if he's in danger? The witness, I mean. What if they find out he talked to me? We'll protect him, Yuri said firmly but gently. I'll make some calls. Quietly. We won't use force, but we'll make sure he's watched over. For him, for your mother, for all of us. I know, Yuri said, and his voice wrapped around her like warmth. But we're not alone, and we're not stopping. Tu Tieu looked out the window at the empty road, the mist still thick and heavy. Yuri, she said quietly. He was willing to speak. He was starting to trust me. And then the moment he saw Mr. Tuan's face, everything changed. What is Mr. Tuan hiding that scares people into silence? Yuri didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was low and resolute. That's what we're going to find out. Tu Tieu closed her eyes, holding the phone close. Outside, the mountains stood silent, holding their secrets. Inside, the tea had gone cold, but the truth was finally starting to breathe. Tu Tieu stayed on the phone with Yuri for another moment, neither of them speaking, just breathing together across the distance. Finally, Yuri broke the silence. "I'm coming to you," he said gently. "I'll leave the site early. You shouldn't be alone right now." She wanted him there. "I know I don't have to," Yuri said softly. "I want to. I'll be there in 2 hours. Lock the doors. Don't open for anyone you don't recognize." "I will," Tu Tieu promised. After they hung up, Tu Tieu moved through the tea house slowly, her mind replaying every word the witness had said. She locked the front door, pulled the curtains halfway closed, not enough to look suspicious, but enough to feel safer. Then she sat at the corner table where the man had been and opened her notebook. Black car, tinted windows, missing page. Second folder, silver clip with engraving. Fresh ink smell. Mr. Tuan's car present. She paused, staring at the last line. Mr. Tuan's car. That single detail changed everything. It meant he wasn't just passively involved, he was there, watching, coordinating. Tu Tieu set down the pen and looked at the cold tea still sitting on the table where the witness had left it. She picked up the cup carefully, as if it held something precious, and carried it to the counter. She didn't wash it right away. Instead, she just held it, thinking about the courage it took for that man to walk through her door. He had carried his secret for months, unable to sleep, unable to find peace. And the moment he tried to speak the truth, fear chased him away. She thought about Mrs. Ngia, who had also tried to protect the people she loved by disappearing. And she thought about Yuri, who carried the weight of his company, his mother's absence, and now this web of lies, yet never once raised his voice or let anger win. Tu Tieu made herself a fresh cup of tea and sat by the window. Outside, the mist was beginning to lift, revealing the green slopes of the mountains. Peace was something you had to build carefully, brick by brick, truth by truth. A message from Yuri. On the road, bringing soup from the market. Have you eaten? Tu Tieu's eyes filled with unexpected tears. Even now, in the middle of everything, he was thinking about soup. Thank you for coming. His reply was immediate. Always. Tu Tieu wiped her eyes and stood, moving to the small kitchen. If Yuri was bringing soup, she would make rice and tea, and she would set the table the way Mrs. Ngia had taught her slowly, with care, because rituals mattered when the world felt unsteady. She was folding napkins when she heard it, a car slowing down outside. Her heart jumped. She moved to the window carefully, peering through the gap in the curtains. It wasn't Yuri's car. This one was dark, unfamiliar, with tinted windows that reflected the mist. Tu Tieu's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back from the window, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. The car didn't move. It just sat there, like it was watching. Tuan's name spoken in fear, and she thought about Lin, who always knew how to appear at exactly the wrong or right moment. Then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, the car pulled away, disappearing into the mist. Tu Tieu exhaled shakily and immediately dialed Yuri. He answered before the first ring finished. Tu Tieu? Yuri, she said, her voice tight but controlled. Someone just stopped outside. A dark car, tinted windows. They didn't get out. They just watched, and then they left. She heard Yuri's breath catch, then steady. "I'm 20 minutes away," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Keep the doors locked. If anyone comes back, don't answer. Just call me." "Tu Tieu," Yuri said gently, and his voice wrapped around her like a blanket. "I'm almost there." Tu Tieu nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I know." But as she stood in the quiet tea house, watching the road where the car had been, one question burned in her mind. Did they follow the witness here, or had they been watching her all along?